Imagine that you find yourself in France just a few days before the French Revolution. The monarchy still stands, the court lives as usual, the king is in place. Yet these are already the final days of the old order, not by the calendar, but in essence. Now we will simply show you how royal France lived on what was effectively its last day, conditional perhaps, but already doomed. How King Louis lived his daily life, while the country was slowly approaching the point of no return. Make yourselves comfortable, this will be interesting. The first and principal reason the regime of Louis collapsed was the nobility. Not the people, not philosophers, not conspirators, the privileged class itself, a class that turned the country into a source of funding for its own pleasures. French nobility in the late 18th century lived as if the state existed solely to finance its entertainment. Versailles was the center of this world, not a place of governance, but a permanent celebration. Feasts followed one after another. People ate for hours, in great quantities and ostentatiously. Gluttony was not hidden. On the contrary, it was emphasized as a marker of status. Wine was consumed from morning until night. After long dinners and nighttime amusements, servants scrubbed the halls of the traces of yesterday's revelry before dawn, so that by midday, the court was once again ready to receive guests. Money flowed into tableware, clothing, jewelry, fireworks, theaters, and the maintenance of an endless retinue. Private evenings and masquerades often turned into outright orgies. Contemporaries wrote about the complete moral looseness at court. Relationships changed as easily as costumes. Mistresses appeared and disappeared. Intrigues intertwined with bedroom affairs. Scandals did not ruin reputations. They were part of court life. This was especially true of the circle around Marie Antoinette, whose name became a symbol of extravagance and indifference to everything happening beyond the palace walls. This world of pleasure also existed under conditions that today are difficult to reconcile with the image of a refined Versailles. At the height of the so-called gallant age, around 1,000 courtiers, men and women, lived permanently in the palace, along with several thousand servants. At the same time, Versailles had no toilets in the modern sense at all. This entire mass of people used chamber pots. Formally, maids were supposed to empty them, but in practice, their contents were often simply thrown out of windows into the courtyard or gardens. We know this for certain because in the middle of the 18th century, a special decree was issued strictly forbidding the dumping of waste from palace windows. Such bans do not appear without systematic abuse. Even after that, order did not improve. Many courtiers did not bother with pots or servants at all and relieved themselves directly in dark corners of corridors, behind doors, in alcoves and stairwells, without embarrassment and on any scale. The stench in the overcrowded palace was so strong that people tried to drown it out with perfume. This is why contemporaries often referred to the king's entourage as the perfumed court, not out of a love for fragrances, but out of sheer necessity to conceal the everyday reality of this idle world. Against this backdrop, it becomes clear why countless erotic encounters were moved outdoors whenever possible. There, among the alleys and bushes, one could breathe in jasmine, pretend to elevated emotions, and briefly forget what royal luxury actually smelled like. Versailles demonstrated decay, not only moral, but physical. Beneath layers of silk, perfume, and ceremony lay filth that could no longer be masked or ignored. Hunting was another form of amusement taken to absurd extremes. These were not outings for food or necessity, but multi-day spectacles. Thousands of people accompanied the court. Dozens of carriages, servants, cooks, musicians. State affairs were postponed because hunting took priority. Meanwhile, in towns and villages, people did not know what they would eat the next day. The nobility did not simply live richly, it lived brazenly. It paid no taxes, bore no responsibility, and at the same time fully controlled access to power. Any attempt at financial reform ran into resistance from the privileged. The state was suffocating under debt, but the court continued to celebrate. It was this gap between uncontrolled indulgence at the top and growing hatred below that made the explosion inevitable. The second reason for the end was the king's own way of life, which became not merely the background of the era, but its symptom. Louis did not merely tolerate moral excess at court. He set the tone. His personal lifestyle became a model for the entire elite and one of the main factors in the decay of power. The king drank heavily and regularly. Wine accompanied him from morning until night and was part of his daily routine as naturally as meals. Moderation was foreign to him. If the table was set, one had to eat. If wine was served, one had to drink. Feasts in his presence rarely ended on time and almost never ended sober. He ate heavily and greedily with little sense of restraint. Contemporaries noted the king's inclination toward gluttony, toward rich, fatty food served in large quantities. After such banquets, he would fall into a state of apathy, from which he could be pulled only by another hunt or another amusement. Hygiene interested him little. Louis could go for weeks without bathing, limiting himself to perfumes and changes of clothing, scents, masked odors. But this did not eliminate the overall impression of neglect and physical deterioration, which even sympathetic observers remarked upon. Licentiousness in his life was no secret and required no justification. The king had numerous mistresses, and their number changed with astonishing ease. These relationships were not romances in the usual sense. They were part of everyday existence. Women appeared, disappeared, replaced one another, leaving no trace except another turn of intrigue. Louis saw no sin or problem in this. For him, it was the same element of daily life as hunting or eating. The king's intimate life had long ceased to be a private matter. His mistresses directly interfered in state affairs. They influenced appointments, access to the king, his moods, and his decisions. Louis did not resist this influence. On the contrary, it suited him. Governing was boring, while pleasures required no effort. He willingly handed over responsibility to whoever happened to be closest at the moment, without thinking about the consequences. Hunting occupied a special, almost pathological place in his life. It was not entertainment, but a form of escape. For weeks, sometimes months, the king would disappear on hunting expeditions. People said of him without irony, if he was not hunting, then he was doing nothing. During these periods, the governance of the state effectively stopped. Documents waited, decisions were postponed, problems accumulated. Hunting allowed the king not to think and not to decide, and that was precisely what he sought. Even Louis's participation in military campaigns looked like a continuation of his lifestyle, rather than the fulfillment of duty. What was officially called Operations in Flanders was in reality a mobile court. The king was not invited there as a commander. He was transported as a symbol. He did not lead or command. His presence was meant to signify the grandeur of the monarchy, but in practice, it turned into a burden. The king traveled with his mistress, the Marquise de Châteauroux, along with all her belongings, chests, hat boxes, jars of rouge. At every stop, covered galleries were hastily constructed between her quarters and the king's to preserve the illusion of comfort and intimacy. Behind them followed the kitchens, an innumerable household staff, servants of every conceivable category. Separately came a troupe of actors, with props, musical instruments, and personal baggage. All of this clattered, roared, and stretched along the road for an entire mile. This procession was supposedly heading off to fight a war. In reality, it served the habits of a single person. War became a backdrop, and the king a passenger, carried, entertained, and shielded from reality. Contemporaries described the spectacle with open sarcasm, without hiding their sense of absurdity. The state was at war while its head drank, ate, hunted, and changed mistresses. The third cause of the revolution was the people, or more precisely, the conditions in which they had lived for years. Without rights, without protection, without any margin of safety. France in the late 18th century rested on people who constantly lived on the edge of hunger and collapse. Any disruption, a poor harvest, rising prices, a cold winter, immediately turned life into catastrophe. The diet of the majority was extremely simple. Bread, that was all. Sometimes water or thin porridge was added. Meat was a rarity for ordinary people. It was eaten on major holidays, if luck allowed. Chicken, later considered the most accessible food, was almost unknown to vast numbers of French people. Many never ate it in their entire lives. They knew such food existed, just not for them. Bread was the center of everything. The price of bread was the main indicator of calm or panic. If a loaf became more expensive, people began counting days. If it disappeared altogether, riots began. In cities, lines formed. People rose before dawn to secure a place at the bakery. Often there was not enough bread for everyone. They returned home empty-handed. Anger accumulated not from ideas, but from hunger. Clothing reflected this existence. People wore rags. A single jacket could be worn for years until it finally turned to tatters. It was patched, altered, passed along. Clean clothing was rare. Shoes were a luxury. Many walked in collapsing footwear or without shoes at all. In winter this meant cold, illness, and death. Living conditions were cramped. In cities, several families shared a single room. In villages, people lived in huts with earthen floors. Smoke from the hearth dampness, parasites, the constant smell of poverty. Disease spread quickly. There was no money and nowhere to seek treatment. Losing one's job or falling ill meant only one thing: a fall with no chance of recovery. At the same time, the tax burden fell precisely on these people. Peasants and the urban poor paid for almost everything: taxes, levies, obligations. The nobility and the clergy either paid nothing at all or paid symbolically. Ordinary people saw this every day. They knew they worked the most and received the least. This knowledge required no explanation. Powerlessness was as ordinary as hunger. A common person could be punished, fined, or arrested without much explanation. There was no one to complain to. Courts were expensive. Protection did not exist. Any conflict with a representative of authority almost always ended in defeat. Fear was a constant background to life, and through all of this, people saw how the elite lived. Rumors traveled fast about feasts, hunts, mistresses, luxury. The contrast was unmistakable. People did not read treatises, but they knew how to compare. They saw that their own lives were constant deprivation, while others' lives were endless pleasure. It is important to understand the people endured for a long time. This was not a crowd dreaming of rebellion. These were people who wanted to eat, to dress, and not to die of cold. But patience has limits. When bread becomes inaccessible, when children go hungry, when the state exists only for others, anger ceases to be abstract. The revolution did not begin with slogans. It began with empty kitchens, worn-out clothing, humiliation, and the feeling that there was no way out. The people did not want philosophy. They wanted to live. And when it became clear that life as it was could no longer continue, the old system simply could not withstand the pressure from below.